Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're stepping back in time to an era that literally shattered the old world order. Between 1789 and 1815, a revolutionary fire swept through Europe, starting in France. We're going to look at one of the most dramatic political transformations in world history, a cinematic saga full of absolute monarchs, radical uprisings, brilliant generals, and the birth of the modern nation-state.
Okay, let's look at our roadmap for today. We're breaking this epic down into 5 acts. The spark of revolution, radicalism in the terror, the era of Napoleon, restoring the old order, and finally, the rise of nationalism.
Let's dive right into Act 1, the spark of revolution.
So to understand how a centuries-old monarchy just completely collapses, we've got to look at the kindling that started the fire. 4 billion livres. That staggering number was the estimated national debt of France on the eve of the revolution. Basically, the French crown had spent itself into an absolute hole, mostly from funding the American Revolution and fighting some incredibly costly wars. The royal coffers? Completely empty.
And while the crown is broke, everyday people are facing some visceral, everyday desperation. After a string of terrible harvests, France is hit with catastrophic food shortages. Bread prices absolutely skyrocketed, to the point where your standard laborer was spending up to 80% of their wages literally just to eat. Obviously, widespread hunger is going to deepen popular anger against the king.
But it gets worse because this poverty was actually baked right into the system. Under the estate system, society was rigidly divided. The clergy and nobility had these immense privileges, while almost all the taxes fell on the third estate. That's the peasants, the urban workers, and the middle-class bourgeoisie. So you take this massive financial inequality, you mix in some fresh Enlightenment ideas from thinkers like Locke, Rousseau, and Voltaire about natural rights and government by consent, and well, you have a population that is demanding fundamental change.
And all that tension just exploded in the summer of 1789. In May, the king calls a meeting of the Estates General, but the Third Estate delegates are so frustrated they just break away, form the National Assembly, and take the famous tennis court oath in June to demand a constitution. Then boom, July 14th, angry Parisian crowds storm the Bastille fortress. Yes, they wanted gunpowder, but more than that, they were toppling a very real, physical symbol of royal tyranny.
Things move incredibly fast. By August, the National Assembly puts out a document introducing a truly dangerous, revolutionary concept for the time: popular sovereignty. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen boldly stated right in its first article that men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Suddenly, sovereign power didn't belong to kings anymore. It belonged to the people.
Which brings us to Act 2, radicalism and the terror.
Now, initially, France tries out a constitutional monarchy. But as we know, the revolution soon consumes itself and enters its bloodiest phase. King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette try to flee the country in June 1791, and they get caught. That basically shatters any last shred of trust. By January 1793, the king meets the guillotine. That massive power vacuum opens the door for Maximilien Robespierre and his Committee of Public Safety to take control, kicking off a notoriously dark chapter known as the Reign of Terror.
The sheer scale of the state-sanctioned violence during this time is just hard to wrap your head around. We're talking an estimated 17,000 people officially executed by guillotine, with tens of thousands more dying in prisons or from summary killings. The radical distrust was so deep that if you were even suspected of opposing the revolution, you were in mortal danger. It was this brutal cycle that didn't end until Robespierre himself was arrested and executed in July 1794.
Moving on to Act 3, the era of Napoleon. With the terror ending so violently, France is left with this massive power vacuum and a fairly weak government. And in steps a brilliant, incredibly ambitious military commander. It's actually a huge historical irony. After a decade of tearing down a monarchy, France effectively welcomes a military dictator. Napoleon Bonaparte climbs the ranks fast. He gets national fame through these brilliant campaigns in Italy and Egypt, and then capitalizes on that momentum with the coup of 18 Brumaire in November 1799, making himself first consul. Just 5 years later, in 1804, he completely flips France from a republic to a military empire, crowning himself emperor.
But here's the fascinating paradox about Napoleon. He crowns himself emperor, sure, but he also codifies a lot of the revolution's gains through the Napoleonic Code. This was a uniform legal system that modernized France, locking in legal equality and property rights, even if it definitely rolled back some individual freedoms. And as his armies marched across Europe, dissolving old monarchies and redrawing borders from Spain to Poland, He was essentially exporting these revolutionary legal principles at the point of a bayonet.
But, as is so often the case, absolute ambition hits a wall. In 1812, Napoleon launches this massive invasion of Russia with a grand army of around 600,000 soldiers. And it is an absolute catastrophe. The Russian winter, disease, and just relentless resistance decimate his forces during the bitter retreat from Moscow. Almost the entire army is wiped out.
That disastrous retreat really was the beginning of the end. He's forced out and briefly exiled to the island of Elba. But then, in a move that feels straight out of a Hollywood script, he escapes, marches back to Paris, and reclaims his throne for exactly 100 days. Finally, though, in June 1815, a huge combined force of Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia hands him his definitive defeat at the Battle of Waterloo. Napoleon is sent off to the remote island of St. Helena, where he dies in 1821.
Next up, Act 4, Restoring the Old Order. So, with Napoleon finally out of the picture, the victorious powers have to figure out what to do with a completely shattered Europe. They gather at the Congress of Vienna to try and smother whatever flames of revolution are left. Austrian Foreign Minister Prince Clemens von Metternich leads the charge here. His whole vision is about balance of power and legitimacy, meaning putting the traditional monarchs back on their rightful thrones. He forms the Concert of Europe to squash liberal movements. But honestly, they're fighting a losing battle. Millions of people across Europe had already been exposed to the Napoleonic legacy of self-governance and the abolition of feudal systems. You can't just unring that bell.
Which brings us to our final act, Act 5, the rise of nationalism.
Nationalism is this incredibly powerful belief that people sharing a common language, culture, or history deserve their very own independent state. And it was a direct, completely unstoppable consequence of the Revolutionary Era. The Congress of Vienna desperately tried to turn back the clock, but these nationalist movements just wouldn't stay buried. Fast forward to 1848, and a massive wave of revolutions called the Springtime of Nations erupts across Paris, Vienna, Berlin, and all through the Italian and German states. Now, early attempts at unity, like the Frankfurt Parliament, did fail, but the seeds for the modern nation-state, they were firmly planted.
Later leaders realized that building a new nation wasn't going to happen through parliamentary debate alone. It required military power, iron and blood. Otto von Bismarck famously used Prussia's military might to defeat Austria and France, finally completing German unification in 1871. Right around the same time, figures like Giuseppe Garibaldi and Count Cavour are fighting to successfully unify Italy. Nationalism was rapidly becoming one of the absolute most powerful forces in the modern world.
So, why does all of this history actually matter to us today? Well, because the legacy of this era is literally all around us. That revolutionary motto, liberty, equality, and fraternity, went on to directly inspire independence leaders like Simón Bolívar to build brand new republics in Latin America. And the Napoleonic Code? It's crazy to think about, but it still forms the bedrock of civil law in dozens of countries, including places like Louisiana and Quebec right now.
But we also have to acknowledge the darker legacy here. While the rise of nationalism liberated a lot of people and forged these new modern nations, it also aggressively redrew the geopolitical map. All that intense national pride and competition directly fueled the massive, incredibly devastating global conflicts of the 20th century, most notably, of course, World War I.
We're going to leave you with this final thought to ponder. The monarchs at the Congress of Vienna tried so hard to restore the old world, right? To just stuff the genie back in the bottle. But history shows us that the ideas of liberty, equality, and national identity sparked back in 1789 were just impossible to put out. Once people realize they actually have the power to shape their own destiny, can that revolutionary spirit ever truly be extinguished? Thanks for joining us for this explainer, and keep learning.